Welcome back, everybody, to Philosophy 101, What Does It Mean to Be Human? In this video, we're going to cover the response paper assignment guidelines. You'll recall that this is one of the three assignment types to go along with the discussion board assignment, which was covered in a previous video, and the exam assignment, which we will cover in a later video. So what we're looking at here is the Moodle page for our course, and the first place we should go and the first document we should look at is the document which outlines the guidelines for the response paper assignment. So here we are in the general course and information area. Let's go down to the response paper guidelines. And if you pull up this document, all the information that I'm going to go over here will be found here as well. Now, the first thing we should say are just a few things about what the purpose of the assignment is and what it is you'll be doing. So basically, the response paper assignment is a short writing assignment where you will be required to respond or engage in philosophical argument about some specific area of the text. And the purpose of the assignment then is twofold. One, it's going to help develop your skills in close philosophical reading and your ability to explain philosophical arguments. That is, through completing this series of papers, one hope is that you'll better be able to understand, decipher, and explain another person's argument in a way that would make sense to somebody else. Secondly, the other major skill and purpose of the assignment is to give you practice critiquing or criticizing philosophical arguments. That is, going beyond just explaining what the author is saying and actually moving into saying, well, here's a problem with the argument, or explaining a criticism of it. So that's the basic purpose of the assignment. And I want to start off by going over a few of the nuts and bolts points about the basic requirements of what you'll be required to do. So first, as I said in the syllabus video, there are actually 4 response papers that you are required to complete throughout the course of the semester. However, if you look at the syllabus, as we said, there are actually 9 opportunities throughout the whole semester to complete them. And so what that means is that you get to choose which 4 you want to do, of course with one restriction in place. You must complete at least 2 of the first 4 response papers, meaning at least 2 of the response papers prior to February 28th, which comprises response papers 1 through 4. So again, you could do response papers 1 through 4 and be totally done. You could do 3 of the 4 and just have 1 to go. You could do 2 of the 4 and meet the requirement. But if you do any less than 2 of those first 4 papers, you will necessarily be taking a 0. And of course, you don't want to do that because the response paper assignment, each one being 50 points, does represent a pretty significant portion of your grade. So you can choose which ones you submit. You don't have to do response paper 1, for instance, but you do have to do 4 out of the 9 total and at least 2 of the first 4 opportunities. Now, where you can see the due dates for the response papers, there's a couple ways you can find them. So one, if we go back and take a look at the syllabus, you can find these on the course schedule. So for instance, the response papers don't actually begin until a little later in the semester, until week 4 in February. So here's response paper 1, and the next week in week 5, there's response paper 2. And so as with all the other assignments, if you go to the syllabus, you can find the due date there. And as I said before, the response papers are always going to be due on Sunday of each week, in which there's a response paper at the end of the day. So for instance, response paper 4 is due Sunday, February 28th at 11:59 p.m. MST. Okay, so that's one way to find the due date for the response papers. The other way is on this response paper document itself. So if you go back up to the table of contents, you'll notice that there's a description of each response paper assignment, 1 through 9. And if you just click on any of these, let's just go to response paper 3 as an example. If you click on any of these, it'll give you the due date. So here you can see that response paper 3 is due Sunday, February 21st at the end of the day. So next we should talk a little bit about the length and format of the assignment. There is a word requirement for the assignment. The assignment must be at least 600 words. But this is just a minimum, right? So there's no maximum, right? There's no maximum amount of words over which if you go over that, I'll take off points. There's just a minimum of 600 words overall that you must meet. In addition, there are more specific word requirements that in order to explain, I need to say something about the format of the paper and how it should be structured. So your paper must be divided into 3 separate sections. First, there's an explanation section, then there's an analysis section, and finally a bibliography. And so the very first thing I would do when you're getting started on your response paper assignment, I would format it in just this way. So for instance, here's an example of a response paper. You can see that I have a title at the top, Philosophy Upon Pain of Death, Socrates' Defense of the Philosophical Life. I've written my name at the top of the paper, and I have the 3 section headings that are here. The explanation section, analysis section, and bibliography. There's a couple reasons why I require the section headings. So first, it will help you organize the paper in the way you need to make sure you meet the requirements of the assignment. The assignment requires you to explain and criticize a philosophical argument. All of your explanation will be done in the explanation section. All of your philosophical criticism and argumentation will be done in the analysis section. So it just keeps you on track and keeps the paper nicely organized. It also makes it much easier for me to grade because I will be looking for specific things from your explanation and also specific things from your analysis. So if I know exactly where those are found in your paper, it just makes the grading much easier on my end. So from a formatting point of view, you will be required to have these section headings. And the reason that matters for the word count is that although the word count overall is 600 words, it's also required that each of the explanation and analysis section have at least 200 words. So your explanation section by itself needs to be 200 words. Your analysis section by itself needs to be at least 200 words as well. And the reason I do this is just because I want the paper to be relatively balanced between these 2 different tasks, right? I don't want you to spend 590 words in a detailed explanation of an argument and then have like a 1 or 2 sentence analysis or criticism of the argument. I want it to be more balanced, so you need to have at least 200 words for each of those sections. But again, there is no maximum. You're certainly encouraged and welcome to go beyond that for whatever you need to do for that paper in particular. Okay, so those are the major things to keep in mind in terms of the word count. And I'm going to take some time in this video to explain more specifically what I'll be looking for in the explanation and analysis sections where the majority of your grade will come from. But before I get there, I'll just say a few things about the bibliography section, as this will take the least time. So the bibliography section is simply where you will cite all the sources that you used in your paper. Now there's a couple points to make here. First, are you required to use any sources? And the answer is yes. You're required to use at least one source, and that source is whatever paper you are writing about. Right? Your paper is always going to be about some specific reading that we're doing in the class, and so because that's the case, you have to at least cite that paper. Now you might wonder, okay, well, what citation information should I use? We don't have a textbook, all the readings are online, I may not know exactly where these are coming from, so where can I find that information? That's an excellent question, and you can actually find that on this document I'm looking at right now. So let's go up to the table of contents, and let's go to bibliography. And here you will see a list of all the readings that will be required for the response paper assignment. Right? Any response paper you do, it's going to be about one of these readings. Now in the example I'm currently using, which I believe is from response paper 2, if I remember correctly, from the example I'm using, it's from the reading Plato's Apology. And so we scroll down, Plato, Apology, and we can just go ahead and copy and paste and put that right into our paper here. And get it formatted correctly. And your bibliography section is complete. Now I say it's complete, right? You're only required to cite one source, and that's whatever paper you're writing about. However, if you do use other sources, and I'll say a few things about using outside sources later in this video, but if you do use any other sources, then those should also be cited in your bibliography section. And just for a helpful reference, if you want to get some examples of how to do citation, I have some examples here. So here's an example for an academic journal article, or a book chapter, or a book, or anything like that, right? So any source you use should be in the bibliography section. You have to cite at least the writing you're reading about. And I would also say, don't feel like you need to go out and get a bunch of sources. If you find something that meets my requirements, that's an academic scholarly source, and you think is useful, then that's great. But really what I'm looking for in this paper is for you to focus in on the reading and explain and criticize the reading as much as possible. So that really should be your focus, as opposed to talking about a bunch of other sources outside of that reading. So now that we have a sense of the basic structure of the paper, let's get into the content, and I'll explain what I'm actually looking for in this assignment. So remember, there are two major sections, the explanation section and the analysis section, and I'll first cover the explanation section. The purpose of the explanation section is simply to explain the argument that the prompt is asking you to explain from the reading. Right, you're not going to engage in any criticism or evaluation or analysis of that argument. All of that will wait till the analysis section. In the explanation section, you're simply going to attempt to provide the clearest, most detailed, and most compelling explanation you can of the argument, such that someone who is not already in this class would be able to understand what's going on in this reading, even if they hadn't done it. That at least is the goal. So how do we go about doing this? Well, first we should take a look at the prompts for the assignment. So here I have an example of a prompt for one of the response papers, response paper 1 specifically. And I'll just show you where you can find this on the document itself, beyond the instruction portion of the document. So if we go up here and we go to response paper 1, then you'll see that these same prompts appear here. And the same goes for all the other response papers. Sometimes there's just one prompt that you can choose from. Sometimes there are multiple. So in this case, there are multiple prompts. So what does that mean? If you want to do response paper 1, that means you should select one and only one of these prompts. You either write about essay prompt 1 or you write about essay prompt 2. For this particular example, I'm going to pretend that we are writing about essay prompt 2. And I'll say a few things about what the prompt is going to do. So first, it's going to identify an area of the text. So notice what it says. At 28b, Socrates imagines that someone has asked him the following question, and there's the question, and then it gives Socrates a response, right? So the first thing the prompt is doing is identifying some area of the text that you're going to focus on. So the first thing to say is that your paper should largely be about the argument that Socrates, or whoever the author is making at that portion of the text. But you also want to do the entire reading, because you probably won't be able to understand that portion as well if you can't explain it within the context of the entire reading. But it's just that the focus of what you're talking about should be the specific argument that is outlined in the prompt. So then the prompt goes on to explain that you'll be writing about this argument that Socrates makes on pages 32 to 35. It tells you to explain the argument that Socrates makes here. And then you see I have some questions here, right? So it says, why has this practice of philosophy put him in danger of losing his life? Why does he believe someone must never do anything that's unjust? Why would it be unjust of Socrates to stop practicing philosophy? Now, when you're explaining the philosopher's argument, how should you use these questions that I've given you? So one thing to keep in mind is you don't have to feel like you have to answer every single one of the questions I put there. Maybe you will in the course of explaining the argument. That's totally fine. The reason I put them there is just to sort of help get your mental juices going, to help you start thinking about some of the questions you would want to answer if you're going to explain this argument. So don't feel like you have to go down through your paper at answering every single question I put. Maybe you'll want to focus on some elements more than others. Those questions are just there to sort of guide you in the right direction towards many of the points that are most important in the reading in the selection that the prompt has identified. And then the prompt will conclude by telling you that in your analysis section you should criticize the argument that Socrates makes here. So you're explaining the argument in your analysis section, then criticizing it or giving some reasons why it could be wrong in the analysis section. Okay, so let's say you've chosen essay prompt 2. Your next question is, well, how should I go about this, right? What are the steps I should keep in mind when explaining a philosophical argument? And that's an excellent question. Now, I'll say a few things about that up front. First, what I say in this video is not going to completely suffice for giving you a sense of how to do this. And largely speaking, That just is because you get better at explaining and criticizing philosophical arguments by doing them. Right, so the idea is the more practice you get at this, the more you watch the lectures, the more you attempt to do the response papers yourself, the more you read philosophical writing, just the better you will get at this. And that is one reason why at the end of the semester, when I'm doing grade adjustments, I do take into account improvement on the response paper assignments over the course of the semester. That being said, I will give you some general guidelines to keep in mind and some steps that you can follow for when you are completing and writing your explanation section of the paper. And the way I always think about it, right, when I make a lesson and I'm trying to explain a philosophical argument to a student or someone else, I always keep in mind the following 3 questions. And I think you should too. So first, question 1, what is the conclusion of the argument? What position is the author arguing for? Now, from our previous video on logic and the structure of argument, you know that the conclusion is just the statement or the proposition that the author is attempting to show is true. And so you might think it's odd to start here. Well, why would I start at the conclusion? Doesn't the conclusion go last? I would actually suggest that the first thing you should do before you start writing it all is get very clear to yourself on what is the exact conclusion that the author is arguing for in this paper. And in fact, you might even begin your explanation section. I think this is a very effective way to begin. Right, here's our sample paper again. I think a very effective way to begin is to start off by telling your reader this is the conclusion that the author is attempting to establish. So you might say in something like in Plato's Apology, in our current example, Socrates argues that, and then you would fill in with whatever you believe the conclusion is. Right? So this is a sentence that's good to have in your explanation section, right? A sentence that begins by telling the reader exactly what the author is arguing for, and then after that you'll attempt to fill in the blanks about how the author gets there. So that's the first question. What is the author attempting to show is true? What is the conclusion? The second question is, what are the premises of the argument? What are the major reasons that the author uses to demonstrate that the conclusion of the argument is true? Now again, from our video on logic and the structure of argument, you know that the premises are the reasons the author gives for why the conclusion is true. And so once you have the conclusion, what I would suggest you do then is identify the premises. Now you could do this in one of 2 ways, right? One thing you could do is you could do what I do in many of our lessons and the lecture videos, and what we talked about in that video on the logic and the structure of argument. You could give an outline in your paper, a P1, P2, P3 conclusion outline. So you could say, well, I think the first premise is this, giving your own rendition of it. Second premise is that, maybe third premise, and conclusion. Right? You could give an outline like that in the way I do in many of our lectures. But you don't have to do that, right? If you would just rather sort of explain in paragraph form, okay, I've said the conclusion, here are the major premises that the author uses to get to that conclusion. If you're more comfortable doing that, that's totally fine. Sometimes students get a little bit nervous about constructing premise-conclusion outlines because they think, well, are these really the right premises? Is this actually a valid argument that gets all the way at the conclusion? So it's really just a tool. If you find it helpful to use a more formal or standard outline, that's fine. If you just want to explain it in like a paragraph form, that's totally fine too. It's really up to you, but the one thing you want to make sure you do is say, these are the major premises that the author is using to get to the conclusion. And the reason why it's so important to do that is because later on in the analysis section, you'll see that one of the things I recommend is identifying at least one of the premises of the argument and saying this is the premise or the premises that I'm going to focus my criticism on. Okay. So let's say you've identified the conclusion, you've said here are the premises the author uses to get to that conclusion. What is the next step? So the third question I have here is, what justification does the author provide for the premises of the argument? In other words, what reason does the author provide for us to think that the premises are true, in particular the most controversial premises? So what does this mean? Well, so let's say you have this argument outline, P1, P2, P3, conclusion. The next question the reader would have is, well, why should I think the first premise is true? Why should I think the second premise is true, etc., right? What a justification for a premise is just another argument or a reason why we should believe that premise is true. So what I'll really be looking for in your paper is that you go beyond just stating what the premises are, but you really dig into the details of why the author believes those premises are the case. And when you're doing this, even though you're ultimately going to criticize the argument in your analysis section, you want to do this in a way that makes the premises seem as compelling as possible. You want to ask yourself, what are the best reasons that the author has for thinking these premises are true? And sometimes that'll just be a matter of explaining what's already in the text. Maybe the author went to some pain and at great detail explained an argument for the premises that he's using. Or maybe the author didn't actually explicitly go into much detail about that. And when that's the case, maybe your job will be to say, well, look, the author has this premise that could be defended, but the author doesn't maybe spend much time explaining why. So one thing I'll look for in the best papers is that they'll ask themselves, they'll go beyond the text and they'll say, well, here are some good reasons, even if unstated by the author, here's some good reasons that one could have for thinking this premise is true. So ultimately, what we're looking for with the justification of the premises is just an explanation of why those premises could be considered to be correct. And one thing to focus on here, you'll notice that in question 3 I said particularly the most controversial premises. What do I mean by the most controversial premise? Well, just the premise or premises that would generate the most disagreement. Right, sometimes in a philosophical argument there will be certain premises that pretty much anyone would agree with. They're not very controversial. Even people who disagree with the argument itself might agree with that specific claim. But then other premises will be very controversial. That's where the philosophical action will be going on. Those are the premises that will generate a lot of disagreement. And because they're the ones that will generate a lot of disagreement, they're also the ones that most likely you would want to spend most of your energy explaining and then probably criticizing in your analysis section. So another sentence that, if you have it, really lets me know or shows me that you're doing a detailed explanation of the argument would be something like this. You might say, well, let's unbold this. You might say something like, the most controversial premise of Socrates' argument is, just hypothetically, P2. The reason Socrates has for arguing that P2 is true is, and then explain that justification of P2. Right, so again, don't feel like you have to follow the exact wording I have in these sentences. I don't actually think those sentences, as I've written them, are all that impressively worded. But the point just is, if you are identifying, here's what I think the most controversial premise is, I'm going to take some time to explain why the author thinks that it's correct, then this goes a long way towards having a complete and excellent and detailed explanation of the argument. So that's what we're looking for. Identify the conclusion, and identify the premises, explain why the author believes the premises are true. Finally, one general comment about what I'm looking for in the explanation section. I've used this sort of term I call a complete explanation. And what do I mean by providing a complete explanation of an argument? I just mean that if you completely explain a philosophical argument, then your reader, upon reading your explanation section, should be able to understand the argument in all of its detail, even if they are not acquainted with philosophy, are not in this class, and have not done the reading. And I really encourage you to apply that standard, right? So you should write a first draft of your paper. Then you should read your explanation section again and ask yourself, if someone who was not in this class read what I just wrote, would they really understand the argument? Or is the only way that someone can understand what the argument from what I've written is if they already had the background knowledge of having done the reading or of having heard about the argument before. And so what this means is that when you're completing your explanation section, and really your paper as a whole, you shouldn't think of me, the instructor, as your audience. Instead, think of your audience as being like an intelligent roommate or a friend that you have who's not in this class but would be able to understand philosophical argumentation if it's explained to them well. I think if you look at your paper, not just your explanation section, but your paper as a whole, through that lens with those eyes, then ultimately you'll come much closer to providing what I would consider to be a complete explanation of the argument. And ultimately, that's what I'm looking for in the papers that are going to get the best scores. Now that we have covered the explanation section, let's turn to the analysis section. So once you've given a complete, full, and detailed explanation of the argument in your explanation section, in the analysis section you will criticize the argument or explain a problem with an argument or why it could be incorrect. Now the first question you might have is, well, why am I required to criticize the argument? What if I think the argument is sound? What if I think it's a good argument? Why can't I agree with the argument? This is a good question, and my reasons, there are a couple of reasons I have for requiring this. The main thing is that, to keep in mind, is that this paper is an academic exercise, right? It's intended to be practice in philosophical argumentation. I don't necessarily see what you write in this paper as being an expression of what you truly believe or your most fundamental commitments or anything like that. My purpose is just to get you to engage in a more critical and close way with the reading. And so whether you actually agree with the argument you're writing about or not is really a secondary point. The real point is that if you engage in criticism of the argument, then it is more likely that you will be forced to engage in deeper and more critical philosophical thought. Right? If you just write a paper agreeing with everything the author says, then you don't really have to push the text very far. You maybe don't have to think as deeply about what the author is saying. But if you are required to disagree with it, then you really have to think about, okay, what is wrong with what this author is saying? You can't parrot or repeat what they're saying. You have to attempt to find problems with it. And I actually think this is and maybe it's most productive when you're dealing with an argument that you actually think is correct. Right? So if you're dealing with an argument you think is correct, you think it's a good argument, and you're still forced to criticize it, then that will force you to find potential weak spots, and it'll help improve your own thinking. Because then you can say, well, here is a possible weak spot that maybe I wouldn't have thought about before, and now I can sort of revise my thinking to say, well, how can I strengthen this point, or how can I still defend the argument in face of this criticism? Overall, I think the intellectual habit of subjecting our own opinions and the things we believe to scrutiny is really a crucial thing to get from this course, and it's really a crucial component of philosophy. So in any case, that is why you're required to criticize the argument. It's just going to make you engage in a deeper way with the reading. Okay, so what will I be looking for here, right? You'll see, and this is just a selection from the prompt, it's always going to tell you to criticize the argument that the author makes. And so let me give you a few guidelines on how to do that. The first guideline I would say is that the best papers, the ones that get the highest scores and are really the best organized and structured in the most coherent way, usually have a sentence that is something like this. Again, you don't need to replicate this exact wording, it's just an example. Right? So you might begin your analysis section by saying, while Socrates' argument has some strong points, I believe his argument is unsound because P2 is false. Okay, so again, P2 is just something hypothetical, right, from the previous argument that we explained. It doesn't matter in this case. But the reason this sentence is significant is because it does one thing. It identifies what part of the argument you're criticizing. So one thing that is very common among students is to read an argument, have a general sense they disagree with it, and then write about why it's incorrect, but never say which premise is wrong. Well, in a philosophical argument, the conclusion depends on the premises. And that means if there's something wrong with the argument, there must be something wrong with at least one of the premises. So if you begin your analysis section by identifying which premise you're going to disagree with or criticize, then that shows you have a very clearly structured paper. It shows you have a clear plan in mind. You're not just making a general criticism of the argument. You're making a specific and detailed criticism of the argument. And that's exactly what I'm looking for. Now, after having some sort of opening sentence like that, what would you do? Well, then you would go on to criticize P2, or in other words, or explain why it is false. Right? The rest of your analysis section will be devoted to explaining why the reasoning the author gives for the second premise is incorrect. And notice, this is why your explanation section is so important. In our example, we're just imagining that premise 2 is the most controversial premise. You've spent some time explaining why the author thinks that P2 is true, even though it's the most controversial. And then in your analysis, you criticize that reasoning from the author. And because you've spent the most time explaining the author's reasoning for the second premise, then you'll want to go and rebut or respond to all those points in your analysis section. So, just as in your explanation section, you want to spend the most time explaining the most controversial premises, in the analysis section, you'll probably want to spend the most time criticizing also those most controversial premises. Right? So, in terms of baseline guidelines, that's the first thing. Identify which premise you're going to criticize. The next basic guideline I would give is that one thing I'd look for in your analysis section is that the criticism you make demonstrates that you understand the argument. So what can often be what happens with students' papers is that when making a criticism, they will talk about the topic in general, but they won't talk about the specific points the author makes. Right, you might make a criticism that applies to the topic area in general, that might be something that someone else would say, but you never actually criticize what the author, him or herself says. And so that's what I'm looking for, that you identify a premise of the argument to criticize, and that the criticism you make actually attacks their argument as it actually is. It's not a straw man, meaning it's not some incorrect version of the argument you set up just to make it easier to knock down. You're actually attacking what the author actually said. That's another crucial point. Beyond that, the best papers in their analysis section are going to make criticisms that show a lot of philosophical depth, that show a lot of creativity and critical thought. And again, this isn't something I can tell you just how to do in this short video. It's another reason why I really look for consistent improvement in the response papers. If you do the readings, if you pay close attention to the lectures, if you give a full effort on the response papers over the course of the semester, then hopefully you should be able to gain or come to understand what it means to pose a philosophical criticism, what it means to engage in philosophical argumentation. And so the papers that do that in the best way, that show the most critical thought, that show the most creative thought about the argument, that really go beyond the text and show that they're thinking about the issue discussed in the text in a deep way, those are the papers, those analysis sections are going to get the best scores. Now that we have covered the major content for the paper, the last point to wrap up will be to say a few things about citation and paraphrasing and the bibliography. So first, about citation in the actual text of the paper itself. You will be required to have in-text citations in your paper, and the way you will be doing that is in the following format. So for any source that has page numbers, first you will have the author's first name, a comma, and the page number you're citing. If you're using any outside source that doesn't have page numbers, right, so for instance if you found a relevant news article or something, then just the author's last name would be fine. Okay, so your paper must have in-text citations within the body of the paper itself, but I want to say a few things about these in-text citations. First, in this paper, you should never use direct quotation. So what do I mean by direct quotation? So let's go back to our sample paper. And so what I mean is the following. Let's say you have something like, Socrates says, and then you have a direct quote taken right from the reading, and then you have the citation, author last name, and page number. Now, there's nothing wrong with this in-text citation. That's the correct format. You have the author last name, in parentheses, you have the page number at the end of the sentence. What's wrong here is that for this paper, you should not use direct quotations. You should not take any direct quotations at all from the reading. And the reason for that is the following. This is a relatively short paper, so I don't want you taking up a lot of the space just repeating the exact words that are actually in the text itself. So no direct quotations. But then you might say, well, wait a minute, why would we have in-text citations if we don't have, we're not using any direct quotations? So you will use in-text citations for all paraphrases, right? And what I mean by a paraphrase is just when you are explaining a point made in the reading, or you have some sentence in mind that you're explaining and you're putting it in your own words, right? And so this is what you'll do instead of direct quotation. But I want to make a few points about this, because the ability to properly paraphrase and explain an argument is one of the crucial things you're really going to be grading on here. So there's a couple things I'm looking for. First, you'll want to make sure that the way you paraphrase demonstrates your own understanding of the argument. So that means, as the common phrase goes, you should be putting what the author says in your own words. Right, sometimes what I'll see is basically a student will have what amounts to very close to a bunch of direct quotes from the reading, but they're just not the exact words, and they're not put in the quotation marks. Now, I guess while that's technically a paraphrase, it's not really what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is for you to put the author's points in your own words in a way that shows you understand. So something you can think about doing is, for instance, using your own examples. Because if you think about, to use your own example to explain something in the reading means you need to understand it yourself and then apply it in a new context. And if you're capable of doing that, then that is an excellent way of explaining the author's points in your own words. That's a very effective way to paraphrase. So, and the second point is, even though paraphrases are not direct quotes, even though you're putting it in your own words, they still need to have an in-text citation. And that means you could have a situation in which a number of different sentences where you're explaining different points the author makes throughout the reading could all come from different page numbers, but all the sentences could follow each other in your paper. So what I mean by this is the following. So here's just an example. You might say, look, Socrates claims that, and then you have a paraphrase of the claim that he makes. Now, it's not a direct quotation, but Socrates must have said this thing somewhere in the reading, and if he said it somewhere, there must be a page. And so here we have Plato and page 12. Then later, he shows how Meletus' claim is incorrect by, and then paraphrase what he does. And let's say that's from page 15, another in-text citation. Finally, Socrates also responds to Meletus' point by, and then another paraphrase, but let's say this point comes from page 17. So these are three different paraphrases of three different points made at three different points in the reading, and so they all need their own in-text citation, and they all need to have their own page number attached. So that's what I'm looking for in terms of paraphrase, and you'll just want to make sure you don't have any direct quotations. Okay, now what else to say here? So I also want to say something about plagiarism. Right, so plagiarism is something I'm looking for, and it's important to be clear up front about what that means. Plagiarism just is any attempt to pass on your own work, the work of another as your own work. That could be another student of the course, that could be something that you found on the internet. Any attempt to make it seem like this thing that you found that someone else did was your own work will be considered plagiarism. Now, just know that I do look for it. It is not incredibly difficult to find in most cases, and if I do catch a case of plagiarism, it will result in you getting a 0 on the assignment, and in this case, for the response paper assignment, I would not allow you to make it up with another paper. You would have to take at least 1 0 on the assignment. Now, like I said, most of the time, especially in an online class where this happens, is a student will search the internet to try to find information on the reading or the topic that we're talking about in class and find text there and just simply put it into your paper. This is not what you want to do. And even if you're not directly plagiarizing, I also want to say that there's other sources that just aren't appropriate for this assignment. So one example would be Wikipedia. There's nothing wrong with Wikipedia in itself. I think it's actually a valuable resource. But for an academic paper, for an academic assignment, it's simply not an appropriate source. Only scholarly sources should be allowed. and Wikipedia simply doesn't apply. Just, if you find any blogs, internet discussion forums, that shouldn't be used. Also, the most common online class notes posted by the professors. This is not something that you should use either, and it's also the most common route to plagiarism. It's the most common way in which students end up getting a 0 on the assignment. Now, if you are looking for outside sources, if you want, in addition to my lectures and lecture notes, if you want another outside source to get a little further background on the topic, there are 2 things I would recommend, and I have links to them here. There's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, also the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You can find a number of different philosophical topics there that will be discussed, and it can be helpful. The Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy is usually aimed a little more at beginners, so I might suggest starting there, but both of them can be valuable. Finally, the last thing I want to say about the response paper is just a word about grading, and you can find the grade scale here on page 9 of this document. So I'm not going to go through everything here because it's basically what I've talked about in this video, but you can see that the grading is broken down to 3 categories: 20 points for basic requirements, 15 for explanation, 15 for analysis. So the first thing is, everyone should get a 20 out of 20 for the basic requirements. It's really just stuff like, did you submit the paper on time? Did you meet the word requirement? Do you have section headings? Do you have in-text citations? Do you have a bibliography with the right bibliographic information? All that stuff, right? If you can answer yes to all the questions in this section, there's no reason you shouldn't get a 20 out of 20 on that part. And then for the explanation and analysis, I'll assign you a grade out of 15. I have a rough grade scale here: excellent, good, average, poor, and acceptable. I will also give grades in between those exact scores, but that just sort of gives you a sense of what the scores you get on each of those sections mean, or mean at least in my view, right? So you'll get a score of 15 for the explanation, a score of 15 for analysis. You add those all up, and that's 50 points, and it'll be your overall score on the paper. Okay, so I will stop there. Hopefully that gives you a sense of what you need to do for this assignment. Again, I know that this assignment can sometimes seem intimidating, especially because philosophical argumentation is, I would imagine, new to many people in the course, but I'd really just encourage you to dive in and know that I am there if you need help. Also, if anything I've explained in this video doesn't make sense, please feel free to contact me and I'll be happy to answer your questions. But I will stop there for now. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.